of Jewish and non-Jewish listeners, and it was efficient. After 2 months, this program was cancelled. Never again it was produced anymore, and the journalist in charge of this program was sent away. So I think that the public should be organized. Now, what is your comment also on the chief rabbi compliment, the former chief rabbi compliment for the people? Chief rabbi. Okay, sorry. I didn't read every detail, but I heard about it. So I would like to know what is the reaction of the community.
What did he say?
Concerned.
I'll talk about the chief rabbi first because it's an easier answer to give, and it leads into the second question. The chief rabbi is unquestionably the most eloquent supporter of Israel that the English Jewish community has. He frequently speaks out in public and in private in support of Israel, and he frequently speaks out in public and in private attacking the BBC's coverage of Israel. And he does so eloquently. The chief rabbi has is almost unique in Anglo Jewry in having good relations with the BBC at a very, very senior level. And he was actually asked to change his Thought for the Day programme at the last minute, just after Hutton was published, and asked by the BBC to do it on the BBC, which he previously wasn't going to touch. That was a very, very sensitive time for somebody in a very sensitive relationship with the BBC to deal with an extremely difficult topic. And what he attempted to do was to issue a very mild rebuke and state the BBC has a reputation for producing fair and honest and good reporting. Let us hope that it gets back to those good old days when it actually does its job. That's what he was saying. I accept, clearly, he failed to communicate that message. And most people heard him praising the BBC, and they did not hear the rebuke. That was perhaps their failure, perhaps it was his failure, but it is certainly not a failure in intent. And what I find terribly sad and really pathetic in its real sense of the word, that the Anglo-Jewish press should fill its pages immediately following Hutton with attacking their own best spokesperson. And it's just pathetic that it sells more papers to try and criticise the chief rabbi than it does to criticise the BBC, when the chief rabbi is standing out there doing his best in his way. And there's no question which side he's on. And so I find it depressing that people are worrying about that. I think the chief rabbi is not the target here. The BBC is the target. So that's my answer to that part, but it leads into the second. One of the things which the chief rabbi did was he managed to get an invitation to address the 100 most important people within the BBC. And he used that address to mention his concerns. And then Greg Dyke, then chairman, then Director General, said, well, what can we do? And the chief rabbi said, well, why don't you show the context, do a programme on the history of Israel, just as you were suggesting programmes should be done. Well, I don't know whether the programme that was shown a couple of weeks ago was the programme that was produced in response to that request. The request was made, and the fact that that dialogue can exist and did exist, in my view, is to the benefit of the Jewish people. The programme, and this is where we come to the real problem of the BBC, the programme is one which contains a very subtle message. And it depicted two mythical Palestinians, a 16-year-old and a sort of 22-year-old. The 22-year-old was depicted wandering pathetically around Jaffa with an ancient rifle, getting his 16-year-old innocent-looking brother to sort of duck behind walls while he pathetically fired at a few tanks of invading Israeli soldiers. And the message given, the actual text, I'm afraid I don't have it with me, was that this poor chap, Ahmed, whatever his mythical name was, had two choices, to flee or die in the fighting. And why? No mention of the fact that the Declaration of Independence stated clearly that all citizens of the state were going to be treated equally, that all the Arab citizens had a right to stay, and those that did stay did get the vote, were allowed to stay, etc. No mention of that was made whatsoever. And what was stated was that actually Israel's existence hung in the balance until a cabal of Jews in New York influenced the president to support the state of Israel. And once the president of America had declared his recognition of the state, its success was then inevitable. Now, no mention of the fact that Russia actually was the first country to recognise the state of Israel. No mention of okay, well, I'll be corrected. Okay. No mention of the fact that the weapons were actually coming from Czechoslovakia. And a complete distortion. What they were doing was they were transmitting onto 1948 the narrative which they believed they like to put down today. Today, the narrative is, if it weren't for a cabal of Jews influencing American policy, then America would no longer support Israel and all the problems of all Muslim fundamentalists around the world would go away. That's the narrative. And if you're doing a history program of 1948, well, somehow transform that narrative into that history. So I actually think there is a problem. We should have programs being made that show the other side. It's very difficult with the present structure of the BBC to give those programs any airtime at all.
Dori, and afterwards Professor Gerald Steinberg.
It works. Thank you for the presentation and for your paper, which you did with Manfred Gerstenfeld, the interview, which really opened up to many of us your very important work. I have really two questions. One is having to do with, do you know if foreign embassies complain to the BBC and whether that has any impact? The case I had in mind was one time late night being in London, I was watching a BBC production about the status of Egypt. And they had hired a Syrian woman to do this special on Egypt, and they actually showed, remarkably, a joint U.S.-Egyptian military exercise called Bright Star, which occurs every 2 years. Now, Israel has always viewed privately Bright Star exercises with a certain amount of concern because the Egyptian army then learns the secrets of air-land warfare, and if should Egypt ever return to a hostile position against Israel, its tactical military capabilities will be considerably improved. Nonetheless, this Syrian woman who lives in London, who spoke for Egypt, spoke for this BBC special, claimed that the Bright Star exercises show how Egypt is under American military occupation. And again, if I was the American ambassador in the UK, I'd be writing a very stern letter. And I'm sure cases like that repeat itself over and over again on the BBC. So I was wondering whether you were aware of any, in your work on this, any correspondence. The other thing is just an observation. I was in London about 8 months ago and having dinner with a member of the House of Commons from the Conservative Party who was telling me that on one of the British ships, the Ark Royal, coming back from the war in Iraq, the British Marines asked that the BBC be removed from the television screens of the ship because of its unfair coverage of the war. I don't know if you'd heard that or, in any event, those are my questions or observations.
Sorry, I'm destroying the recording equipment here. Yes, that is true. It's correct. And a number of people have asked me why Malcolm Bailyn was appointed as a sort of Middle East czar within the BBC.
Middle East what?
A Middle East, he's been appointed as a person to ensure impartiality and coverage of the Middle East. And it's an entirely unique appointment. There's never been an appointment of someone with this kind of brief. And it's a clear recognition, although of course the BBC didn't admit it, that they're getting things wrong and that there's a problem there. Now I think that there are certainly two, and people have suggested a third reason for that having occurred. I think one of the reasons is Israel's very publicised decision to to break off normal relations with the BBC, and I believe that did have an effect. I'm almost alone in thinking there was a positive side to that. There were clearly problems that it was too open-ended, but the fact is it had, I believe, an impact. I think the fact that the British soldiers in the Ark Royal turned the BBC off was a real shock to the BBC. And I think the third thing is the vast body of complaints which they've had, of which mine is merely one, but I think these complaints have also had an impact. And I think that, they are ultimately sensitive to public opinion. I think the fact that what would really be important would be to get allies, because there are other groups within British society and probably around the world, as you say, other countries that feel they're being continuously poorly and improperly represented by the BBC. And one needs to create an alliance of those forces so that there is a serious pressure starts to build up, not just from Israel.
Gerald, thereafter Judge Bach.
Trevor, in some ways you've answered at least half of my question, which was on the appointment of the BBC's Middle East czar and some of the pressures that led to that. But could you expand a little bit on BBC Watch, what you've been doing, what you think the impact is, and perhaps some broader lessons about privatization of what we call hasbara, what governments can't do, individuals and organizations can often have at least some effect. So if you can go a little bit into detail of your experience with BBC Watch and also where you think that might be going in the wake of the Hutton Report. What are the opportunities here and what can be done? And also limitations.
Right. I think the limitations are fairly obvious, and I've been talking about those. But I'll talk briefly about Malcolm Bailyn. Malcolm Bailyn, I think, is well-meaning. But there are huge problems with his appointment, and his appointment demonstrates the nature of the problem within the BBC, its arrogance and its inability to recognise what's wrong. Malcolm Bailyn should be an independently financed, powerful force within the BBC with an independent authority to make decisions and cause things to be changed and to publicise his findings. The reality is, Malcolm Bailyn is a former BBC journalist. I don't criticise him for that because many journalists in the UK were at the BBC at some time or other. His direct boss is Richard Sambrook, the head of news, who is a very, very significant part of the problem in my view. And he has no particular budget. He has no clear terms of reference. He has no obligation to produce even private reports within the BBC, let alone public ones. And one can just imagine that someone in that position is really going to either say nothing or bring out one report and lose his job. The structure of his appointment is an indication of how far from properly understanding the problem the BBC really is. So that's to answer Malcolm Bailyn. In terms of the impact I've had, when I produced my first report, the BBC wrote a one-line letter. There were about 1.5 pages, but it basically had one line at the bottom saying, "We're sorry you're unhappy with BBC coverage, we are not." And that report went all around the world on the internet. I didn't publish it, other than just kind of send it to 2 or 3 people. When I had a meeting with a group of very, very senior BBC journalists at the House of Commons with the Anglo-Israel Association, they just kind of put me on their ticket, so I snuck in under the wire. And I was sitting opposite the number 2 of news, just below Sambrook, and then the head of World Service, head of Radio News, head of all the heads of various news organisations. And when I introduced myself to ask a question, I said, "My name's Trevor Asserson, and I've done a little bit of coverage, a little bit of analysis of the BBC," and you saw them all going like this. And one of them said, "There's one line in your report I really don't like." And I thought, great, he's read my report. And they'd obviously all read my report. And then I got a great honour, 2 honours really. First of all, they produced a 20-page refutation, which was actually longer than the guts of my report. Some of it very good quality refutation, I have to say. A lot of it was garbage. And then, when I produced my second report, I got a real accolade because Richard Sambrook threatened to sue me for defamation. He didn't quite threaten it, but he said, "You have defamed me," and he put PS CC Litigation Department. That really worries me. The litigation department should get something because being a litigator, that's obviously my bread and butter. It would be hard to think of a bigger PR faux pas for the BBC than to sue me in defamation, so I would welcome them doing so. But anyway, when he alleged that I had defamed him, I actually took advice from a defamation barrister, and to be absolutely sure that I hadn't. And I hadn't because, forgive me for giving you a brief lesson in defamation law, I hope that you know as little of that particular area as I do. Essentially, one can legitimately express an opinion where that opinion is based in fact. One cannot state a fact. So if I were to say, you have X view, that's a fact. If I think, I believe that you have X view because of your expressing the following, then that's not an actionable defamation. Now, what the letter that I didn't realise was in front of you now is just before giving this talk, not telling me, Mr. Sambrook wrote to Ambassador Dorigold, and he said, this is paragraph 3, Mr. Asserson stated that he has received a veiled threat, etc. We go to paragraph 2. In fact, he distributed a press release which alleged that I believe the suicide bombing of Israeli civilians to be politically legitimate. Well, that's actually not right. I didn't say that he believes this. What I said is that Richard Sambrook appears to argue that suicide bombing of civilians is politically legitimate. The reason I argued that is because when I asked why don't you use the word terrorist to describe the acts of Hamas, he says, well, I'll give you the exact quote, if I can find this easily. He said the political legitimacy of these acts is hotly contested. So he considers it's fair enough to say that he appears to argue that. It's not the same as saying that he does believe this. For the record, Richard Sambrook has told me that he does not believe that killing women and children is politically legitimate, and it's a relief to know that. It's a shame that it doesn't come out very clearly from the material that he broadcasts. He then goes on in his letter to say, and he has not responded to my request for him to withdraw this false claim. Well, first of all, he has not accurately reported, or fairly reported, or indeed impartially reported what I said. He has also told a complete lie, because he says, I've not responded to his request for him to withdraw this false claim. Well, I have responded. And when I got this letter the day before I left for Israel, that was on Sunday, and on Monday, from Israel, I got one of my assistants to check with the BBC and to speak to his PA. And on the third attempt, after considerable insistence, I got an acceptance from the PA that they have received my response. So what Richard Sambrook has done is misreport what I've said about him in a letter to Ambassador Gold, and then actually state something which is a complete lie, saying I haven't responded. He doesn't like the response, but I have responded. I'm not quite sure what the question was that I was asking.
What does PA do?
But
You use
Personal assistant.
a personal assistant, I'm sorry. So I'm glad I've answered the question. Please remind me what it was one day.
Judge Bach,
Sorry, to finalise the question, I believe that the BBC's responses to me do indicate that this kind of complaint does have an impact. They are bothered by it. That's my point. Thank you.
Judge Bach, afterwards, Fiamma Nierenstein.
My question is not intended in any way to detract from the impact of your very impressive survey. But I want to ask you, I mentioned Gilligan before, and that he, after all, was forced to resign as a result of the Hutton report. And you said, but he was only one. I had somehow impression, I may be wrong, that there was some report that the demoralizing effect on the BBC of this, and that they were, how embarrassed everyone was there, and that many from the editorial board should consider resignation. However, I wanted to ask you, apart from Gilligan himself, were there not some additional people from the editorial board who were forced to, as a consequence of the Hutton report, to resign? And do you think that, after all, it might have some deterrent effect on the BBC? And have there been any opinion polls, for instance, after that, in England about the results? I mean, I know that some people said the Hutton report was a cover-up or something like that, but I heard conflicting reports on that. Could you perhaps just elucidate a little bit more on that point? Whether there might be, after all, some more optimistic result of a report like the Hutton report.
You're absolutely right. Not only Gilligan has resigned, but also the chairman of the governors and the director general, the two most senior people of the BBC. So it's had a significant impact. They were found to have failed appallingly at their jobs, and there was really no other choice for them. The moment that Greg Dyke resigned, he first of all he threw a huge party, which was much publicised by the BBC news coverage, showing all the BBC personnel supporting him and complaining that he'd been hounded out by a whitewash government-sponsored report, for which there's no evidence at all that it's a whitewash. And Greg Dyke is now an extremely eloquent sort of hero figure who is going around being given a lot of airtime to say why he thinks that he was right to defend the BBC's independence. And the public opinion appears to be swinging continuously behind the BBC, sadly, and in particular is saying, well, the message the BBC is putting out is, okay, we got that wrong, that report was wrong, but the ultimate message that there were no weapons of mass destruction and the war was therefore a dreadful error was right. So we got a few details wrong. And that message, that story, unfortunately, is being swallowed, I think, by the British people. And that's a terribly sad fact. And that's why I think that we need to produce, we need to damage the brand. We need to embarrass the BBC sufficiently often that the British people start to lose confidence in the BBC, and they start to recognise the nature of the structural problem which the BBC exists, as I set out earlier. And I think, unfortunately, what is likely to happen is that there will be a degree of soul-searching, there will be a degree of embarrassment within the BBC, and they will probably tinker with the structure. They'll slightly improve the complaints procedure. I spoke yesterday evening in a public meeting with Andrew Steele, the head of the media, the head of the Middle East for the BBC, and he stated publicly that they are going to look at their complaints system. But what he was really saying is the structure is basically going to stay the same. They'll find a new person to be on the head boy, and the structure is going to stay the same. And I think that is a serious opportunity in Hutton. We need to press home the advantage that Hutton has given us in this particular argument, and it's not being pressed home at the moment.
Fiamma, and afterwards Rona.
Can I press something? No. So I see that you're keeping as a hopeful horizon the idea of privatization. But I'm wondering why. Because all the private media that you see around, most of them keep exactly the same point of view as the BBC does. I mean, they're not sanctioned because of their lies, or they're not sanctioned because of their bias. It's a sea of wrong information that kept even an ideological dimension, where BBC is just a part of it. So, do you believe that the BBC is worse than the general bias that is spreading all over in the media? That's the first question. Second question is just to have your opinion. Do you think the BBC is worse than the CNN?
CNN has at least admitted that it was more or less forced to tell lies from Baghdad. I'm not sure the BBC has actually admitted that. I have not compared CNN coverage with